That is the first thing I want to say, because it is the first thing most people assume when they hear what I am about to describe. And the assumption matters, because it sends people in the wrong direction, toward a waiting room, toward a prescription, toward a diagnosis that technically fits the symptom while completely missing the cause. What I am talking about is something different, something quieter, something that does not show up cleanly on any clinical inventory and that most doctors will not have the time or the framework to identify even if you tried to describe it accurately, which most people never do. Because accurately describing it requires naming something that feels almost too ordinary to constitute a real problem. Here is what it actually feels like from the inside. You wake up. The room is familiar. Your body is functioning, more or less. There is nothing acutely wrong. Nobody is in crisis. Nothing urgent is demanding your immediate attention. By every reasonable measure, the morning is fine. And yet there is something, a flatness, a hollowness, a low and persistent absence of something you cannot precisely name that settles in during those first few minutes before the day finds its shape. A feeling not of sadness exactly, but of something adjacent to it. Something that asks, quietly and without drama, what exactly any of this is for. And then the day starts, and you move through it. And the feeling does not go away so much as it gets submerged beneath the business of ordinary life. Until the next morning, when it is there again, in the same place, asking the same question, in the same low and patient voice. If this is familiar to you, if you heard something in that description that recognized itself, then what I am about to say matters more to you than almost anything else I could spend the next few minutes on. Because the feeling has a specific cause, not a chemical imbalance, not an inevitable feature of aging. A mistake, one that most people over 70 have made so quietly and so gradually that they have no memory of making it. And one that, understood clearly and honestly, is entirely possible to begin correcting. Starting now, starting today, the mistake is this. At some point during the long, busy, productive years of your working life, and for most people it happened without a single conscious decision, you built an identity made entirely of roles, and then the roles ended. And you discovered, in the particular silence of the mornings that followed, that there was nothing underneath them. Let me explain what I mean by that, because it is more specific than it might initially sound. A role is not who you are. It is what you do. It is the function you perform, the position you occupy, the relationship you maintain. Parent, provider, spouse, the reliable one, the capable one, the one people call when things go wrong. These roles are real and they carry genuine meaning, and there is nothing wrong with any of them individually. The problem is not the roles themselves. The problem is what happens when a person spends 40 or 50 years investing their entire sense of self into those roles. When the role becomes so fused with the identity that there is no longer a clear border between who you are when you are functioning as the role and who you are when you are not, because the roles end. That is the part nobody prepares you for with adequate honesty. Children grow up and leave and become their own people with their own lives that do not require your daily presence in the way they once did. Careers conclude. Spouses sometimes pass. The structures that organized your days and gave your hours their obvious purpose and gave your presence its clear necessity. They change, shape, or they end, and what is left is a version of you that was never fully developed outside of those structures. A self that was always defined in relation to something or someone else. And when the something or someone else steps back, what remains is that particular and disorienting emptiness that nobody told you was coming because nobody told you what was causing it. Erik Erikson, the developmental psychologist whose 8-stage theory of human development remains one of the most useful frameworks ever constructed for understanding what people need at different points in their lives, described the central challenge of later adulthood as the tension between what he called ego integrity and despair. Ego integrity, his term for the sense of wholeness and meaning that a person feels when they look back at their life and forward into their remaining years and experience both as coherent and purposeful. Despair, the feeling that arrives when that coherence is absent, when the life feels as though it was built on something that is no longer there, when the self feels contingent on conditions that have now changed. What he was describing, in the language of developmental psychology, is exactly the feeling that the mornings hold for so many people over 70. Not depression in the clinical sense, despair in the existential one. The particular emptiness of a self that was always defined by its utility and that has now, in the restructured reality of later life, found itself without an obvious function. And here is the part that matters most. The part that nobody says clearly enough. That emptiness is not telling you that your life is over. It is telling you that the version of your life built on roles and function and external purpose has completed itself. And that the version built on something deeper and more personal and entirely your own is waiting to begin. The emptiness is not a conclusion, it is a space. And spaces, by their nature, are not meant to stay empty. They are meant to be filled with something that was never there before. The psychologist Abraham Maslow, whose hierarchy of human needs has been discussed so widely that it has become almost a cliché, described something toward the end of his career that is far less discussed than his famous pyramid. He described what he called self-actualization, the state in which a person is genuinely, authentically living out who they actually are, rather than who they were required to be by circumstance, expectation, or role. And he observed that most people spend the majority of their lives in the lower levels of the hierarchy, managing safety, belonging, esteem, without ever arriving at the question of who they actually are, when none of those needs are pressing. Later life, he suggested, is when that question finally becomes available, when the noise of survival and productivity and role maintenance quiets enough for the actual self to become audible. And that moment, that arrival of the actual question, is what the emptiness of the morning is. Not absence, signal, but most people do not hear it that way. Most people experience the emptiness as evidence of loss, evidence that the best is behind them, that the meaningful part is finished, that what remains is simply the long diminuendo of a life that already had its important chapters. And that misreading of the signal is what keeps them in the waiting room of their own remaining years, indefinitely, experiencing morning after morning of that particular flatness without understanding what it is actually trying to tell them. Viktor Frankl, whose extraordinary life and work I return to often in these conversations because he understood human meaning more deeply than almost anyone who has ever written about it, described meaning not as something that exists, ready-made in the world and simply needs to be located. He described it as something that each person must create, or more precisely, discover by engaging honestly with what their particular life, at this particular moment, is asking of them. He called it the will to meaning, and he observed that its absence, not the absence of happiness, not the absence of comfort, but the absence of felt meaning, was the source of more human suffering than almost any other single condition. The empty morning is, in Frankl's terms, the will to meaning making itself heard. It is the part of you that knows beneath everything else, beneath the roles and the routines and the comfortable patterns of a life organized around external demands, that there is something it came here to be or do or understand that has not yet fully happened, that the account is not settled, that the most essential thing about you has not yet found its fullest expression. And the silent mistake, the one that sits beneath all of this, is never having asked during the 40 or 50 busy years when asking felt like a luxury you could not afford, the most important question a person can ask of themselves, not what should I do, not what do others need from me, not what am I responsible for, but simply who am I when I am not being useful to someone else. That question is not selfish. I want to say that clearly because I know it will feel that way to some people hearing it. It is not selfish. It is necessary. It is, in fact, the question that every human life eventually requires an answer to. And the only real difference between the people who wake up with energy and purpose and the people who wake up with that quiet emptiness is whether they have found their answer or are still waiting for permission to look for one. So how do you begin? How do you start filling in the outline of a self that was always defined by its relationships to other things and other people? Where do you look practically and honestly for the identity that exists beneath the roles? It starts with a question that sounds simpler than it is. What did you love before you were responsible for anything? Before the career? Before the children? Before the mortgage and the obligations and the particular shape your life took on once it became organized around what was necessary rather than what was true? There was a version of you who was interested in things, genuinely, personally, without any utilitarian justification, who found certain things funny and certain things fascinating and certain things worth staying up late for, in the particular way that only genuine interest produces. What were those things? For some people, they are immediately retrievable. For others, they have been buried so long under the sediment of adult life that locating them requires patience and honesty and a willingness to sit in the question without rushing toward a comfortable answer. But they are there. They are always there. Interest does not die. It goes quiet under the weight of everything else that demanded priority. And the morning emptiness is, among other things, interest that has been quiet for too long, making itself audible and the only way available to it. The neuroscientist and author Antonio Damasio, whose research at the University of Southern California on consciousness and emotion has produced some of the most important findings in modern brain science, has written extensively about the relationship between identity and feeling, about how the self is not a fixed structure located somewhere in the brain, but an ongoing biological process that requires active participation to maintain. The self, in his framing, is not something you have, it is something you continuously do, and a self that stopped doing itself, that handed its construction over to roles and external demands, and ceased the active, curious, personal engagement with the world that builds genuine identity, is a self that will over time begin to feel thin. The recovery of that self is not dramatic. It does not arrive in a single revelation. It comes the same way the original self was built in the first place, slowly, through small, sustained engagements with things that produce genuine curiosity rather than obligation, through choosing one modest decision at a time to follow what is actually interesting rather than what is obviously useful, through allowing yourself to be a beginner again at something, awkward and uncertain and entirely unqualified, and discovering that the beginner state, which felt embarrassing in midlife, is in later life the most honest and available form of aliveness. Julia Cameron, the author whose foundational book, The Artist's Way, has guided millions of people back to creative identity after years of self-abandonment, describes a practice she calls the morning pages, 3 longhand pages of stream of consciousness writing, done first thing in the morning, before the day acquires its structure and agenda. She does not describe it as a writing exercise. She describes it as an excavation, a daily practice of clearing away the surface noise to find what is actually underneath. Many people who have tried it describe the same experience, that the first weeks of pages are filled with complaints, logistics, the recycled content of ordinary daily preoccupation, and then, gradually, something else begins to appear, something more personal, something that had been waiting beneath the noise for long enough that it had almost stopped expecting to be heard. That something is the actual self, the one that was always there, the one the empty morning was trying to reach all along. You are not empty because there is nothing left. You are empty because the structures that were carrying your sense of self have changed shape, and the self they were carrying has not yet learned how to carry itself. That is not a permanent condition. It is a transitional one. And transitions, unlike endings, have a direction. The direction is inward first, then outward again, but differently. Not organized around what others need from you, though that generosity is still yours to offer. Freely and from genuine abundance rather than compulsive duty. Organized, this time, around who you actually are, what you actually find worth pursuing, what the particular, irreplaceable accumulation of everything you have lived and learned and survived has made you, in the specific and unfakeable way that no one else in the world is quite. That person, the one underneath all the roles, has been waiting for a very long time to meet you properly. Tomorrow morning, when you wake up and the emptiness arrives in its familiar way, do not reach for the television or the phone or the comfortable noise that delays the question. Sit with it for a moment. Not with dread, with the honest curiosity of someone who has just realized that what felt like absence was actually an invitation. Ask what it is trying to say. Ask what it has been trying to say, perhaps for years, beneath all the busyness that kept you from hearing it. And then listen, not for the answer that sounds right, for the one that feels true. That feeling, the quiet, specific, unmistakable warmth of something true, is not emptiness. It is you, arriving finally, fully, and without apology at the life that was always underneath the one everyone else could see. Good morning. You are right on time.